Carrie was brief. I will be brief too. The field of cultural studies derived from the British version of that. Well, the word culture comes to us with a double genealogy. There's the Matthew Arnold version of culture, the best that has been thought and written. And then there's this notion of culture that comes out of anthropology. A British anthropologist named Sir Edward Tyler. Culture in one sense is normative, in the other it's descriptive. Anthropology made culture its central concept. Later on, some Marxists getting disenchanted with the notion that they had a theory that could only rather ham-handedly deal with art and the products of imagination decided to appropriate a bit of anthropology. So you got this sort of bastardized discipline arising in which bits of anthropology are grafted onto bits of Marxism. I didn't know the particular piece of history that we have Carrie to thank for bringing this this construction to our shores, but I'm happy to know that. A document testifies to its moment of inception. I think I generally accede that point. Almost every document does, at least in its vocabulary, its rhythms, its prosody, that sort of thing. There is a question of whether knowing that inevitably a document will, to some extent, speak to its historical moment, whether you embrace that and say, okay, let's cram every bias we have at the moment into this document so we have a perfect template of everything that we do that is shameful, that is dubious, that just speaks to how we happen to feel this day, because we all want posterity to know what that is. Or this other intellectual attitude that one can take, which is to say, all right, we know that this is going to be testament to our times, but don't we want to try to speak to the generations? Aren't we going to try to, some extent, get beyond our particular moment and speak to that which is lasting? Now, I hesitate there, and I didn't use the word transcendent. I'm not sure we can be historically transcendent when we're drafting a committee document. But let's say there's at least that question of whether you want to try to speak to lasting principle or whether you want to sort of do filigree on the zeitgeist. And the AAUP in 1915 tried its best to set down what it took to be lasting principles. The AAUP of 2007 decided, hey, what the hell, let's just go with our biases. And I think there's a difference. Those are two different organizations. They have a lot to do with the deeper nature of this debate as to whether we live in a world that is bettered by a search for objectivity, for some attempt written into the genesis of academic work to try to get it right, to try to give the best possible account, mindful of what all the alternatives are, or rather to give the account that just strikes us as most plausible for the moment, and hey, if it's not right, somebody else can fix it later on. I think that's the divide we're on. Someone today mentioned, I think it was Victor Davis Hanson, this moment around 1964, 1965, the free speech movement at Berkeley, which, if you've been following our website, I've been writing a bit about. Steve Balch was there, as it happened, as a first-year graduate student at Berkeley during the free speech movement, October 1st, when the fellow climbed aboard the police cruiser and began that denunciation of Western civilization that continues to this day, but surprisingly had become the dominant discourse in higher education. So, yes, there is something that's happened, and in this, I think Carrie and I are probably very much on the same page. Times change. What was said in 1915 is not absolutely applicable to 2009, but the changes that take place are not merely the momentary blips of cultural fashion that show up when a committee A meets and decides, oh, yeah, Bush is Ahab, let's leave that in. But rather, there are bigger, deeper historical changes, and the particular change that we're wrestling with here is this moment when the liberal institutions, the universities, decided that in the name of liberalism, they just had to open themselves up to that expedited urge to get social justice now. Let's remove the universities from that rarefied world where they tried to stand apart from the flux of life and get a larger perspective on things, which, if not quite transcendental, was at least aimed at what was durable and lasting. Let's put that aside because we've got urgent business to get down to. We've got to solve the racial justice problem. We've got to get women. We've got to get homosexuals. We've got to get everybody who's been excluded by the old system fully engaged and in the system. And as that logic unfolded over the years, it gave us any manner of sort of nonce disciplines that weren't really disciplines. They took on some of the garb of discipline, like a freshman putting on a PhD gown and saying, hey, now I know everything. Well, all those studies, cultural studies among them, are instances of this elevation of political expediency over the search for truth. Now, what isn't right about the 1915 statement? Well, for one thing, it's written from a point of view that all the threats to academic freedom are coming from outside the university. Dewey and Lovejoy and the fellow committee members just didn't glimpse ever the possibility that there would be within the university people who would tear up academic freedom and set themselves up as essentially bullies that would control whatever else was going on. The trustees of colleges and universities have no moral right to bind the reason and conscience of any professor. That's 1915 statement. I think that statement stands, but it's incomplete. Neither does a professor have any right to try to bind the reason and moral conscience of other professors. We have a professor here, Professor Moyer, who's exceptional only in one sense, which is that he went public with his story. This is a man with graduate degrees from Harvard and Oxford, books published by major university presses. He's a specialist in the Vietnam War, with the unpopular view that the war was in some ways rightly conducted. Applied for an open history position at the University of Iowa with credentials that in all likelihood were substantially better than that of nearly all, perhaps all of the other people who applied. He failed to make the short list. And then, as I said, the extraordinary thing here is this happens all the time. Someone who's viewed as on the right or conservative just gets marginalized from the academy. The extraordinary thing that Professor Moyer did was to go public with this and point out that the faculty that excluded him was a history department which had 27 registered Democrats, 0 registered Republicans, that the search committee included an individual who had written a whole book on why the Vietnam War was a terrible thing. It's a real rough version of the events here. The University of Iowa had as an official policy that it sought intellectual diversity, that it wanted diversity of opinions among its faculty members. And using that self-proclaimed position, much as FAR has used the positions enunciated by institutions against them when they violate them, Professor Moyer said, well, what about this? I represented a alternative point of view that clearly is not instantiated in the University of Iowa's history department. Surely I deserved at least to get on the short list. No answer except the banal declarations that, no, he hadn't been subject to any kind of prejudicial treatment at all. I throw him in here partly because I find myself faulted, rather surprisingly, for thinking that academic freedom applied to students. Again, that musty, out-of-date 1915 statement doesn't have any problem with that. The first sentence says there are two kinds of academic freedom, those that apply to professors and those that apply to students. This statement is mainly about professors, although it does include a paragraph at the end that elaborates some of the ways in which academic freedom applies to students. Well, the AAUP now wants to separate those issues. Okay, I don't think that that's an intellectually impermissible move. On the other hand, the deeper urgencies of academic freedom surely arise from what the academic freedom is for. And I'm not fully convinced that our debate so far has touched the bottom of that. Why do we want academic freedom in the first place? Because we want to be nice to professors? No, we see it as a prerequisite to the search for truth. Now, admittedly, that's a philosophical position that itself can be disputed, but it has pretty deep traction in American society. I'm rather much a follower of John Stuart Mill on this. Mill's three basic arguments for intellectual freedom are that, first of all, you might be in error. If you hold doctrinaire to your position, maybe you're excluding something that's actually true. His second argument is that even if you do have the truth, if you're excluding someone else's point of view that validly belongs in the conversation, you're turning your own view into dogma that is sure to become just dead letter to you and to those to whom you would like to convince of it. And his third point is that, in fact, most of the time, none of us have complete control of the truth. The reason that we need free discourse, the reason we need academic freedom, although he doesn't use that phrase, is that we have to have this constant ongoing dialogue in which we each bring forward to the best of our abilities that piece of the truth that is ours to have wrestled free from the maze of fact and opinion in which we are continually submerged. Now, I think Mill has all three of those points right. He's talking about freedom of speech in general. We do have a First Amendment that guarantees freedom of speech, which includes freedom of speech for faculty members. But when we talk about academic freedom, we're specifically talking about those provisions built into an institution that are meant to encourage the free exchange of ideas. Not because that's a nice thing to do, but because that's how we get to where we want to go. We are in pursuit of truth. We're only going to get there by being open to the full exchange of values, of ideas, of opinions well-founded on fact. And anyone who thinks that kind of exchange is characteristic of the American college or university today really is living on a different planet. We are in a world where if you are ever so slightly to the right of the far left, you're going to be in trouble part of the time. You might get by self-censorship. You might get by finding ways to trim your views in strategic situations. But essentially, we are now dealing with a university that is ideologically a monolith. As Steve Balch has sometimes called it, it's monocropping. We have a whole wide range of opinions that just cannot be heard on campus. Who suffers because of that? Students suffer. Faculty members suffer. The institution of higher education suffers in its dwindling prestige. And clearly American society is suffering from the diminution of a once great institution.